Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, all our colleagues at the Ministry of External Affairs and our colleagues in missions and posts abroad. It's a great pleasure today to welcome a very distinguished speaker to the third Atal Bihari Vajpayee Memorial Lecture. This is the first lecture which would be delivered in person because the last 2 years due to COVID restrictions that was not possible. Before the lecture commences, I would like to share with all of you once again what exactly was our thought process in instituting this series of lectures. Now, all of us know Atal Bihari Vajpayee as one of our great prime ministers. I think this ministry has a special claim on him as a foreign minister as well. And not just as a foreign minister, as someone who actively contributed to foreign policy, who even shaped foreign policy as a parliamentarian. So for many of us who actually followed foreign policy debates in the public domain, in the parliament, he was really a very powerful influence well before he became foreign minister. Now, I of course have a particular reason to remember him as foreign minister. When I joined the foreign service, he was the first foreign minister I had the privilege of meeting. But when we look back at his contributions as prime minister, as foreign minister, as a parliamentarian, as someone who really shaped the larger Indian national security and public policy discourse, there are different aspects that come to mind. One which I think the film brought out was, in a sense, the what today we would call cultural rebalancing, which is projecting India's culture, history, traditions on an international stage. But as a practitioner, I think what is particularly important and today very relevant to note is how much, how developed and nuanced his understanding was of the contemporary world, the world in which he operated. And quite apart from the statecraft which is involved in leading a nation like India, the realism that really characterized many of his decisions and approaches. We saw that in the manner in which he transformed the relationship with the United States in the post-Cold War environment, recognizing really how much more important and consequential that relationship had become for Indian national interest. The manner in which he imparted continuity and stability to our ties with Russia. Really one looks at that period, starting from the time when he was foreign minister till his prime ministership and beyond, that at a time when so many important relationships in the world were changing, there was a very unique steadiness about the India-Russia relationship, and I think a lot of it had to do with the personal understanding and the efforts which were made by Prime Minister Vajpayee. Then again, if you look at trying to reach a modus vivendi with China, the fundamental basis for that this has to be on the basis of mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, mutual interest, which we articulate today. I think a lot of it was visible. Going back to the period, going back to actually the then Foreign Minister Vajpayee's visit to China. And of course, our own neighborhood, a neighborhood where he saw all the opportunities of cooperation, but was never impervious to the challenges of terrorism. His realism in using all instruments at his command to actually try to forge a basis of, of relationships in this region, which would very explicitly abjure terrorism. So there is so much that can be said about him. Of course, for all of us, especially in the national security domain, we associate him most of all with the 1998 nuclear tests, with the fact that we became a nuclear weapon power. But to all of you, I would urge you to look not just as the test. Please look and reflect on the diplomacy that followed the tests. The fact that within a space of 2 years after that test, we had engaged all the major countries of the world, had actually brought them around. So when you had a visit of a President Clinton or a Prime Minister Howard or a Prime Minister Mori, or the visit of President Chirac, it was actually the post-test diplomacy, which is something which I think anybody who's in the field of diplomacy should really look at and seek to draw lessons. And I can tell you at that time, I myself was posted in Japan, and it was a relationship which was particularly affected by the nuclear test. But we always drew from the Prime Minister the confidence that we would find a way of settling it down. And indeed, today, when I look at that relationship, I marvel at the wisdom and the maturity with which Prime Minister Vajpayee got all of us to look at that particular challenge. But let me come briefly to today's speaker. The thought which I would like to share with you is that this lecture series is intended to have practitioners, ideally, or practitioners come analysts of diplomacy. People who are hands-on, people who actually work this profession ground up, who understand really the nuts and bolts of it. It is from them we want to hear, because it is through them that we would develop a good understanding and really live up to the expectations of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Now, today's speaker is, of course, a person of great diplomatic eminence in Singapore. But before I come to his personal qualities, of which there are many, I also want you to understand that if you were to look at the world and say, where can I get a healthy dose of realism? Where is it I can spend a few meetings and get a good understanding, a very grounded understanding of how the world is doing? My recommendation to you is look at a small, successful country. Small because smaller states, because they are buffeted by the currents of international relations, it is absolutely existential for them to get it right. They have to have a pulse of the international environment in a manner in which, bigger states can be perhaps, I don't want to say casual about it, but there are more margins of error for larger states. But a successful small state, because if a country continuously reads the international situation right, leverages it to actually make a successful political and economic model of it, goes up remarkably in the span of 1 or 2 generations, then I think that is really where a lot of the learnings are. And I'm not saying this simply because it is a place I happen to serve in, but when I look at all the places I served in, it was a place I met remarkable people with enormous knowledge and experience, with a great deal of understanding of the world, with an ability to continuously, the nimbleness, the sort of dynamism out there, the energy out there. That is something which really sets Singapore apart. And for today's lecture, therefore, there was a great deal, there were very good reasons why we chose a person who can truly qualify as a preeminent diplomat of Singapore, who has been directly, of course, associated with our relationship, but who, serving his own country, knows the world, knows the region, follows the geopolitics, who's been very active in analyzing the big issues of the day, and who has the ability really to connect the dots, because that too is a big challenge in the diplomatic profession. We tend to look at events by themselves. There's something happening between US and China. There's a conflict in Ukraine. There are the consequences of COVID. There's a big supply chain worry. But to piece it all together and then have an integrated picture from which we make judgments, we determine our policy choices, that is really something which is of exceptional value. And I can truly think of no one else today than Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, who has served as Singapore's foreign secretary, who's been a very distinguished ambassador to many places, including Russia, and who served in the United Nations, to speak to us today. Once again, a very, very warm welcome. We are very privileged to have you speak to us today. Thank you.